Welcome everybody. We have a really interesting speaker today, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Keith Bolton. I've been learning a lot about him, about his professional life from the very beginning, all the way through to the wonderful things that he does as a volunteer at the Queensland Maritime Museum. So Keith, as you would realise, he describes himself as an avid amateur historian, with a keen interest in all things marine. He's an honorary life member and volunteer at the Queensland Maritime Museum, where he's been for 14 years. He's one of the Monday crew. He'll probably tell you something about that. And he's involved with guiding events, and he's the editor of the 2 Queensland Maritime Museum publications. He's a retired health and safety and quality assurance lead auditor, so wonderful attention to detail, as you can imagine. He started his professional life as a mechanic with Horney Books in Brisbane, and his experience over the totality of his professional life includes automotive, transport, mining, construction, marine and petrochemical industries. Quite a spread. From 1967 to 1970, he had extensive marine experience with regard to the vessels at Heron Island, and later at the Brisbane River and Moreton Bay with the sand and gravel industry at South Brisbane. He spent 26 years in the lubricant business with Castrol and BP, and he has international experience as well. He's worked in Canada, the United Kingdom, the South Pacific, Vietnam and Thailand. So in anybody's language, that is just a remarkable career, and he's very well qualified to speak on this exciting topic of the remaining wrecks in Queensland. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll introduce you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can you hear me all right at the back there? This is a tricky microphone, I've been told. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, for the introduction. It's a real privilege to be here to do this address to you today. Regarding wrecks of Moreton Bay is something that we've all sort of know about, but no one's really done much about it to find them. So some of the wrecks we'll talk about today you've actually fished on, you've probably walked on, and not realised that they were there. So in the presentation today, we're going to talk about the Bay area, the wrecks themselves, the locations, and the ships and their brief history. So Moreton Bay area is a fairly big expanse of water, as you can imagine. So there are approximately 122 recorded wrecks in the Moreton Bay area, quite a big number. Of those, 70 remain. And the other surprising thing that in the Brisbane River alone has been 76 ships sunk. Of those, 3 remain. And we've only selected 13 today, otherwise we've been here for the nightfall to cover them all. And could I ask you to hold your questions toward the end of the presentation so I can get through on the time? But don't get too comfortable, because I'm going to ask you a few questions as we go along. So the first location is the river mouth and the bar cave. Next one will be Bribie Island with the 2 there. The next ones will be the islands of Peel and North Stradbroke. And finally, Cape Moreton and the artificial reefs. So the river mouth and the bar cutting. That's the Harbours and Marine map of the Port of Brisbane. You can see the old bar cutting and the channel, and we're talking about a wreck here called the Mount Elliott, and she's still there. Her history, that's what she looked like. Not a very imposing vessel. Originally built as a hopper barge in Melbourne in 1884. Worked for Melbourne Harbours and Marine Trust. In 1910 sold to Newman, Morrow and Jackson in North Queensland. And then sold again to Howard Smith in Townsville. Then on-sold to Australian Steamships Townsville, and in 1970 actually sank in Townsville Harbour. But being good environmentalists at that time, they were a recycler. I pumped her out and used it again. And it was sold to Rooney Limited Townsville, which is a very large building construction company to carve timber up and down the coast. In 1928, it was sold to Riverside Coal Transport in Brisbane, and it had the unlikely, gamely job of using to dump night soil. What actually happened was taken into Petrie Bight. The Hunter Brothers cart used to come down there. They'd empty the tin into the ship, then they'd tow it down to the luggage point, surprise, surprise, and discharge it with a grab crane into the water. So that was how they started. In 1935, it started to dredge sand and gravel on the Brisbane River. And then 1937, it got a contract with the coral supply for Queensland Cement and Lime. In 1936, Hornbrooks did some test dredging for Queensland Cement and Lime and around Mount Elliott, and they found the coral was 20 feet deep and enough there for 20 years. So at that time, Queensland Cement and Lime didn't have any vessels, so they contracted it out, and the Mount Elliott became one of those vessels to dredge the coral at Mount Elliott and bring it all the way into Grey Street. That's loaded up with coral, being pushed by Coal Transport ST's Sunrise. And then in 1938, she capsized and sank at the edge of the bar cutting in the river. This caused quite a furor with the port, because it was blocking the port, the ships couldn't get in and out. So in 1939, the hull was partly removed away from the port, and that's a photo of it being part of it taken away by one of the dredges, the suction dredge Bermuda. So the port is back in business again. Now we're going to move in now to the Bribie Island, Pumice Passage, the Avon and the Bongaree. The Avon started off as the Avro, and it was a paddle steamer. It was built in 1867 in Glasgow, sailed out here, and she was a passenger and cargo vessel for the Gippsland Steam Navigation Company. It was made out of iron, and it had two diagonal oscillating engines, coal-fired, to drive the paddles. In 1891, it was beached at the mouth of the Bellingen River in New South Wales, and she was abandoned, but again recycling came to it, so she was auctioned off for £100 and repaired in Sydney. Then it had two owners and used as a coral barge for the Brisbane River until it collided with the Edward Street ferry Kangaroo in 1911. The Kangaroo was a steam passenger ferry at that stage, running across from the Customs House across to the river. In 1914, it was purchased by James Clark and towed to Bribie Island, scuttled in the Pumice Passage. And rumours abound that it was being home for it was an ex-South Sea Blackbird vessel. Blackbird, as you recall, was the idea of bringing South Pacific Islanders to Queensland to cut sugar cane and pick cotton. And that's what she looked like in 1914, 1915, sitting up there in Pumice Passage. And there was supposed to be a South Seas Islander who was supposedly reported living on it, and I believe he was an oyster picker. The oysters were pretty prevalent in Moreton Bay at that time. And it's been a navigation landmark in the passage for more than 100 years, and now rusted to the waterline and visible only at low tide. The Cormorant was another vessel there, built in 1900 in Scotland, and became a relief pilot ship in Brisbane. And finally it was used in 1913 when they had Henley on the Brisbane Regatta at New Farm Park. All the sailing boats and all that came out to see it, and the governor went on board the Cormorant to observe the proceedings. And then finally in 26 it was put up for disposal for tender and sold in Brisbane and cut down to become a coal and gravel item. And in 36 it was hull was discarded when her useful life was over. In 1958 she was beached by the then owner George Sharp and hopped at the entrance to the passage to Bribie Island to protect Mr Sharp's guest house from erosion. And that's what it looked like then. And then finally in 1990 it became too much of a danger, and the local Caboolture Council in those days, Shire Council, cut it up and took it away and dumped it. So now we move on to Peel and North Stradbroke Islands. The Peel Island with the platypus, and Dunwich the Lady Lock. In South Passage, the Rufus King and the Sovereign. This boat, of course, is at the tip of Peel Island. You can probably see a hull when you're going across from Dunwich to Dunwich on the ferry at low tide. So she started off as a bucket dredge for the Queensland government. You have to imagine in the early days of the colony that keeping the ports open was a priority, and therefore they had to have their own dredges. There was no private contractors. So bucket dredges was the main thing they used in those days to dredge out the channels. In 1907 they had a collision with the SS Tenure, and they bowed the Tenure 15 foot into the side of the dredge. The dredge was docked and repaired at South Brisbane Dry Dock. In 1923 it was withdrawn from service, and in 1926 it was condemned and scuttled off the jetty of the bluff at Peel Island. And that's what it looked like when it was first put up there. Now you'll recall that Peel Island was originally started off as its heritage as a leper colony. Before the government passed a law to take all the lepers into one spot, there was a leper colony also on Friday Island in the northern Torres Strait, and also Dunwich was also another leper colony. So they combined all those and put them all in one place. And that's what it looks like today. Now we move over to Dunwich, and that's the location of the Lady Lock. When you land in the ferry and you look across, you see the size of the sand. That's where the Lady Lock is. There's a nice little ship, started off in 1886, built as a lighthouse tender. And then 1890, when the fear of the Russian invasion in those days was live, they can classify it as an auxiliary cruiser and put a gun on it. Never saw action. In 86 to 1832, it serves the lighthouses on the coast of Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, and it was involved in many search and rescue operations. And replaced by tender by the SS Cape York. In 1934 it was laid up at Peter Slip. In 34 to 35 was put up for tender while lying moored to the river. And in 35 to 36 was hulked at Peter Slip and Brisbane River. When they talk about hulking ships, we're talking about stripping all the machinery out of a vessel and just leaving the hull. So the boilers were taken out and just become empty like a big floating cup. And it was converted to carry coal as a light for McDonnell Hamilton. And they used to load the coal at the Kangaroo Point coal loading wharves at Kangaroo Point, no longer there of course. And then they take the lighter down beside the coal ships, and then they unload the coal either by bags or by hand onto the vessels. In 1950 it was advertised for sale and sold to Moreton Bay Lighter at South Brisbane. And in 51 it was converted to a gravel barge. And that's what it looked like at South Brisbane. That's at the end of Tribune Street. You can see the old flour mills there. And finally in 1966 it was no longer required as a hulk was towed to Dunwich and used as a breakwater for the protection of silica sand loading for the facilities of Moreton Tangalooma. In those days Moreton Tangalooma had the contract to carry the silica sand from Stradbroke Island to West End, the glassworks. And that's where the hull looks like today from the air. Now we talk about the Rufus King. It was a Liberty ship. And that's what Liberty ships look like. It's hard to imagine that 2,718 ships were built by the US between 1941 and 1945. Construction took place in 17 yards, including 6 companies owned by Henry Kaiser. It was his basic idea. It was an assembly line construction method using prefabricated sections and they were all welded, and a lot of the welding was done by ladies. And construction time went from 230 to 42 days. And by 1943, 3 ships were launched every day. Unbelievable. Of course, and the German submarine, of course, couldn't keep up with the supply of new ships. And the power was a 140-tonne triple extension compound steam engine, and that's what it looked like. Now, these little steam engines, these big steam engines, were manufactured by numerous machine shops throughout America and sent like a Meccano set to the different shipyards to be assembled to get it underway. That's how they could produce them so quickly. And had 2 oil-fired boilers. The steel construction, single screw, 7,176 tonnes. And this one was named after Rufus King, who had represented Massachusetts in the Constitutional Convention. And she was built between 41 and 42 at California. And she was one of the 467 ships constructed by that shipyard. So in 1942, on March 11, she was launched, and in May 29, she was delivered. And in July, she was loaded up with inboard bound for Brisbane from Los Angeles with military equipment. Unfortunately, the skipper mistook South Passage below Moreton Island as the northwest channel at the north end. And by 9:30 that day, and in light rain, she grounded off Amity Point between North and Moreton and North Stradbroke Islands. The next morning, she broke in half. Breaking in half was pretty common with Liberty ships because of their construction and their design. They weren't very strong. And then the fun began. Because she was carrying a cargo of 9 Mitchell bombers in crates and aviation fuel, there was enough surgical equipment to set up 10 army hospitals, and most of the $6 million cargo was salvaged from the wreck, including the machinery. Now, there's a small story on how they salvaged that. Because there was no steam to drive the winches, Brooks was contracted to put a donkey boiler on board the ship, hook up the steam lines and provide steam to unload all the cargo. A remarkable story. There was no casualty among the crew of almost 40, and in August 29 the front half was sealed and towed to Brisbane for conversion, and eventually it was towed to New Guinea and became a floating workshop renamed the Rufus Half. The stern is still visible and is a navigation hazard at certain tides. Now the paddle steam is sovereign. Can I have a show of hands of those who travel to either Brisbane to Sydney or Sydney to Brisbane by cruise lately? Well, you do it like you do in 2 days now. It wasn't the case back in these days. So she was built in 1941 in Sydney, a wooden hull paddle steamer, maximum speed 8 knots. And fitted with a Bolton and Watt steam engine, nothing to do with me, unfortunately. And was next to another paddle steamer from New South Wales. It was used in Sydney on the Morford Hunter River Run, and then 42 sold to Hunter River Steam Navigation Company. We commenced a fortnightly service to the Brisbane surface, 3 to 7 days. Now ladies, you can appreciate what it would be like on a paddle steamer travelling in rough seas for that days, and you can be rest assured that the weather wouldn't be calm, it would be rough and things. Ablutions would be pretty primitive and the food would be horrible. And no air conditioning and no heating. So in 1847 she departed Brisbane for Sydney, crossed Moreton Bay and laid at Amity Point due to the high seas at the bar. At that period the pilot station was on Stradbroke Island, so they had to go through the passage bar. And they had to wait for the pilot to board the passage. So that's the location where the pilot station was, and that's what the pilot station looked like in those days. That's a sketch. And that's how they got the pilot out of the boats. There were no Aboriginal rowers. It was advised that it's supposed to be very good and got them there on time. And the disaster hits when she started across the South Budgie Bar with the sea, huge seas. The steam engine actually breaks free from the wooden hull. You can imagine the look on the engineer's face when he hears a strange noise, opens up the door and finds out a huge steam engine is running amok at his engine room. That's what the steam engine looked like. That's the memorial to the Sovereign at Amity Point. So she was swamped and capsizes and sinks towards the northern side of the passage. 40 lives were lost, with 10 survivors, and some of the cargo was recovered. The wreck was put up for sale and sold for £14.10. So now we move on to Cape Moreton and the artificial reefs. But before we get to the artificial reef, we talk about the Cementco. And then we talk about Tangalooma and the Curtin artificial reef. And off Moreton Island, we're going to talk about the Centaur. So the Cementco, or the Crusader as it was last name, it was actually sunk near Flinders Reef off Moreton Island. It started off as a fairly modern ship built by for the Australian Army in 1945, just before the end of the war. And steel construction. We had 6 diesel engines, 6 propellers and 4 rudders. Speed of 9 knots. I went into service for after the war with Army service to PNG in Bougainville, probably bringing back equipment. In 1947 it was decommissioned. In 1947 it was also sold to Queensland Cement Mine in Brisbane. And now I'm going to convert her into carry coral from Mount Elliott. The modifications were done by Evans Deegan at Kangaroo Point. That's underneath the Story Bridge where it used to be. Nothing there now, of course, except a beautiful park. And also in the ship they put 2 bottom dock doors, so they could load up with coral and then they could open the doors and the coral would drop out on the river bottom. Its loaded capacity was 2,000 tonnes. And it was renamed the Cementco and entered into the coral transfer operations. And that's a photo of her on her first voyage down to Mount Elliott with one of the suction dredges waiting there to load her up. And then that's what she looked like coming up and down the river. And transferred the coral from Mount Elliott to Oxley Wharf for QCL. The plan of operations was that they'd load it up and sail on the incoming tide from Mount Elliott and travel all the way up the river with the incoming tide. When they got to Oxley Wharf, they'd open up the doors and drop the coral on the bottom. And then electric grab cranes would lift the coral out of the river, dewater it, put it on the conveyor and send it through to Queensland Cement Mine to make cement. And every year, of course, Cementco and the Darrow had to go into a dry dock to be maintenance. That's her at the South Brisbane dry dock. And in '74, they had to shift it down steam because of the '74 flood. And finally, in '84, she was retired from Queensland Service, Queensland Cement Line Service, and the name was changed to Crusader 2 because the new vessel that they were going to put in operation to cart the clinker from Gladstone, the new site to Brisbane, was called Cementco. In 1986, it was sunk to the dive wreck off Flinders Reef, Cape Moreton. An unusual story about that was when they decided to sink her halfway through the operation, she turned upside down, sank upside down. But the divers love it, they tell me.
Oh, that's good.
So it's upside down. In those days, the government laws, there was no environmental laws. You could dump anything at sea that you wished. Now it's a completely different set scenario. We have the case with Queensland Maritime Marine with our steam tug fossils. We have a dilemma where we have to decide what we're going to do. If we make it in a dive wreck, it's going to cost around about $600,000 because you've got to strip out all the asbestos, all the oil, etc. before you can do it. And then you've got to get permission to do it. If we cut up the scrap, it's going to cost another $400,000 to cut up the scrap. So, not easy. Okay, Tangalooma wrecks. These were the good old days when you could just park them up and sink them. So that's what the wrecks look like from the air. And those have been to Tangalooma? Yeah, very good, yes, you know what I'm talking about. So that's their positions. And the one we're talking about today is the Bribie 2, which is another bucket dredge, and that's her operating off Hamilton Reach outside the Butterboard. And then she's the second one to be built, and built in 1954 in Scotland. Twin screws and oil-fired triple expansion engines. The gross tonnes was 738 tonnes. And she worked from 1955 to 69 in the Queensland waters for the Harbours and Marine Department, and in 1970 decommissioned and put up for sale. No one wanted to buy her, so she was stripped and scuttled off Tangalooma and Moreton Island. And that's what she looked like when they first scuttled her. And that's what she looks like today. The government, in its wisdom, decided to cut off all the superstructure to stop the poor drivers getting cut on the steel. Health and safety. At the museum we have the artefacts of the original broker. This is the bell, and originally it was sitting in the Cairns Cross Stradbroke manager's office until they closed it, then he gave it to the museum. And we also have some other artefacts, one of the buckets from the bucket dredge, and one of the reversing steam engines from the broker as well. Now we talk about the Ukai. It's owned by the North Coast Steam Navigation Company. Now you're probably wondering why they had such tall funnels in those days on the ships, and the reason why they had such tall funnels is because of the type of boilers they used, either Scotch or Cornish boilers, who had no forced air feed to the boilers. You need oxygen to keep the fires going, so they had tall funnels to get the draft to suck it out. And as the boilers improved, then the funnels got shorter. So she built in 1923 in Glasgow, and she's able to carry long timber cargoes of turpentine logs from the New South Wales Northern Rivers, and she's named after the town of Ukai in the Northern Rivers. And from 24 to 39 she's working the Northern Rivers Sydney run. That's her up on the slip. And then in 1939 when war started, she was requisitioned like many other vessels, become an auxiliary minesweeper, HMAS Ukai. Conversion included installation of sweeping gear, guns, extra accommodation, and given a new number, S177. In 1942, she was transferred then to the US Small Ships Section, and she carried supplies to Goodenough, Goodlark, and Curtin, Arnold, and Moreton Bay areas during the World War II. And finally, in 1944, she was returned from service, and in 1945 handed back to the owners and went back to the North Coast trade. In 1954 she was sold to Morris Byrne and Company for the timber trade. In 1955-60 she was contracted to Nestles to carry milk. In 1960 Holt in Brisbane, and then bought by Moreton Tangalooma. Originally they took out all the boilers and just had the hull, and then she was used as a lighter for the wharf construction at Stewart Harbour. They put a pile driving frame on the first wharf they built up there. Finally, in 1963, she was fitted with some new Caterpillar engines, put a mobile crane on, a fixed crane on board to grab it, so she could dredge gravel out of the river. And that's her there at opposite Tribune Street. In 1969 and 1974, she was used as a contract with the Harbours and Marine, servicing the buoys in Moreton Bay. In 1976, she was finally stripped and scuttled off Tangalooma and brought home. Now, moving up the coast of Moreton, one place you may not have heard about before is Curtin Artificial Reef. You can't see anything from the surface, you've got to go below to find it. It's right there just north of Cowan County. Curtin Artificial Reef was started in 1968 by the Underwater Research Group of Queensland, and the first item placed on the reef was a gravel barge. To date there's been 32 ships laid to rest, and the Hustler was one of them, sank in 1998. And Frank Curtin, a member of the Underwater Research Group and a keen and prolific diver, was the main diver behind the formulation of the artificial reef, so the reef was named after his honour. Frank Curtin was a diver like Joe Maguire that did all the work around the port in horrible conditions, and didn't live to be a long age because of all their others was working under the water. So that's a number of vessels that are there at the Curtin Artificial Reef. So the two vessels we're going to talk about today are the Lady Norman and the Cos 1. Lady Norman, originally called the Seahorse, paddle steamer built for the Queensland Government. Built by Walkers at Maryborough, iron construction, 176 tonnes. And then in 1894 sold to William Collins and Son in Brisbane. And the ship was then converted to a single steamship with a sail, and that's what it looked like. So you've got to imagine in those days, where are you going to get a steam engine from? You've got to order one from England and wait for it to come out, or get one from Australia from somewhere else, or salvage one from somewhere else. So they fitted it with a salvage one. So can anyone tell me where that wreck is? The dicky at Caloundra. They took the engine out of the dicky. And I renamed it Stranded German vessel, and that's what the dicky looked like in 1893. And we have reports that they used to have dancers on board the ship while it was stranded. And it was renamed the Lady Norman and set up for the purpose of carrying sugar from Bundaberg to Maryborough and Brisbane. That was bag sugar. In 1900, it transferred ownership to William Collins and Sons, and in 1918 converted to a sand and gravel lighter, and dredged sand and gravel from the Brisbane River. And that's what she looked like. Had a steam crane on it with a steam grab to do that. And finally, in '69, shipped and scuttled to Curtin Artificial Reef. Now we talk about the whale chasers. Who went to Tangalooma? Whale season? Anybody? If you did, you would remember the smell. So that was one of the whale chasers, Cost 1, built in 1929 in Ukai for the Norwegian Whaling Company, and operated in Arctic waters in 1936. In 1940, it was hired by the Royal Norwegian Navy as an auxiliary patrol vessel. In 1945, it returned to its owners and renamed to Cost 1. In 1952, it was sold to Whale Products here in Brisbane. And that's what the whaling station looked like in those days. So the whales are dragged up the fencing deck, they shot off the continental shelf, then towed back in again, and you can still see the sharks waiting for the whales, the carcasses to arrive. In 1950, the whale covering was formed, and it was chosen as a site because the largest whale-based station in the southern hemisphere. In 52 to 62, Cost 1, Cost 2 and Cost 7 operated as the whale chasers at Tangalooma. The whale bodies were towed back to the factory, and finally in 1962 the company closed due to lack of whales, surprise, falling prices and demand for the products. Demand for the products was in those days, the whale oil was used to make margarine in England. Then of course the vegetable market picked up, the safflower oil and all the rest of it, and that destroyed their market. They also used to sell frozen whale meat to America for the restaurants over there. At the same time Tangalooma was operating, there was also a whaling station at Byron Bay, and there was also an associate whaling station at North Cole. And after the station closed, the ships were laid up for a while. They were sold a couple of times. That was a photo of her tied up at Family Books at Belinda, waiting to be sold. And finally, in '71, she was stripped and scuttled at Tangalooma with the Cost 2. Now, I thought that today would also talk about the Centaur. It was great when it was found. There was a bit of a history in finding it. Finally, it was launched in 1924 as a blue funnel liner. And in November '41, a lot of people forget that it was involved with the rescue for the German crew that attacked HMAS Sydney off Curtin. In March '43, she was commissioned as a hospital ship. And in 1943, May 14, sunk by Japanese submarine IS-7117 off Moreton Island. 268 lives lost and 64 survived. Some of the survivors were in the water for 48 hours before the American destroyer picked them up. It was found on December 18, 2009, and it's lying at a depth of 2,059 metres. The gentleman that found them, David Manns, actually came to the Queensland Maritime Museum doing his research to locate the wreck. He was interested in finding out how far the lighthouses beam could be seen from the sea. So in the logbook on the ship, they talked about Cape Moreton, and he wanted to make sure it wasn't important lookouts. But his clue on really tracking down of how to find the strip was a bit of hard work. He contacted some of the remaining survivors. One of them was a young girl who was about 5 or 6 at the time, lived with the parents up in Malay on the Montville Range, and they were ship spotters. And the night the Centaur blew up, she was able to take him out and point exactly where she saw the flare over the water. So he took a bearing on that. And the other people he spoke to was 2 army guys who worked on the installation of the guns on the east coast of Moreton, and they said they saw the flash and it was directly due east from him. So those 2 points, plus his other information, helped him find the wreck. And you can appreciate finding a wreck at that meet at 2,059 metres is no mean time. And the other interesting, it's on an acute angle, about 45 degrees, in a gully. So they were very lucky to find it. So that's actually where she is now. And that was the gentleman that actually found us. He also found HMA Sydney. A remarkable story. So in conclusion, folks, we've talked about the Bay Area, we've talked about the wrecks, we've talked about the locations, and we've talked about the ship's history and their brief history. And special thanks to all those following people who helped me put this all together. And thanks for your attention.
Well, that was absolutely wonderful, and especially wonderful that Keith was able to draw this whole history of wrecks that most of which we didn't know about, I'm sure, to broader social and historical events and movements. And that's not always easy to do, and wonderful graphics as well to help us visualise what was going on. You've probably got some questions. Got questions? Yeah, Stephen.
Can I ask a question? I hope you can hear me. Can I ask a question about the location of the 2 Navy ships that were here? They were more just on the river up here. One was the remnants of it are just south of Redcliffe as you head down the coast. Was that vessel, do you know, was that sunk there, or was it? Did it?
We're talking about the 2 vessels that have been sunk for dry wrecks. It was HMAS Brisbane, which is off.
No, I'm talking about 2 colonial vessels.
Oh, the Guyanda and the Tangalooma.
Yeah, exactly.
Righto. Guyanda is down at Scott Point at Scarborough. Not much of it left, and the Paluma was sold to the Victorian government as a lighthouse tender, and it was scrapped about 1950.
Okay. The one up near Redcliffe,
Yeah, that's
right?
the
Paluma. Was that sunk there intentionally, or did it sink there? Did it?
It was put there in a vain attempt as a breakwater. It's filled with concrete and then parked up there.
I know there's bits of it there, and I often wonder when I go past whether it was put there intentionally or otherwise. Okay, thank you for that.
And we've got 2 of the guns from the Paluma and the Paluma Guyanda at the museum.
Can I just clarify?
Guyanda, is it the one at Woody Point, or
The one at Woody Point is Guyanda.
that's Guyanda, not, I think you said Scott's Point just before.
Woody Point, I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question while I'm here too? Lucinda
Yes.
was, I always was told was put at Bishop Island or Wreck Island. Over on the western coast of Moreton Island, there's Lucinda Bay and Shark's Spit. It's between the Big Sand Hills and Tangalooma. And there was a boat there, I remember seeing 50 years ago, a big steel boat with a great big counter stern. And my friend said, oh, that's the Lucinda. Which I've never been able to find out what the name of that ship is. And there's only a boiler left now, but it's always intrigued me why that's called Lucinda Bay as well.
If you can give me a minute afterwards, I'll be able to dig it up and let you know what they are.
Right.
Lucinda was actually, you're correct, it was at Bishop Island. And when the port of Brisbane was developed, they cut up the 19 wrecks that were there and took it to landfill, including the Lucinda. So the only thing we got left at Lucinda, luckily, There's a replica of the smoking room that was off the centre, which was used in 1980-99 to design the Australian Constitution. And it was built as a bicentennial project for the Supreme Court of Queensland, and when they shifted offices, they donated it to the museum, so they pulled it apart and put it back in again. We've also got some of the cutlery, we've got some of the steering wheels, so it's quite a historical vessel to have. There was a lovely paddle steamer. Unfortunately, it was used as a coal lighter at one stage. It got stripped out, but yeah, it gets back to the end of a ship's life. What do you do? Cut them up or sink them? Well, you can't sink them now, so you got to cut them up.
Thank you. We arrived late on account of traffic problems, but my great-grandmother was on the St. Paul, which sank in 1914 at Smith's Rocks. Has any research been done on that?
I think the skin divers have done it, but there's not much. There's research written up on in various places. You can get more history about how they reckon how it took place. It's pretty well documented.
All right, where would I find that?
Probably go on Google and type it in.
Right, thank you very much.
Okay.
They sailed from Nipwe in New Caledonia with a load of nickel, I think it was, and she was bringing my great aunt over to her other grandmother to go to school in Sydney.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, the same location as a couple of other ones there. The Marietta Dell was another Liberty ship that hit the rock and sank. It was unbelievable the amount of mishaps that took place because of navigation of those. Yeah, as you can appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, in the early days of the colony, there was no railway line that went from Brisbane to Cairns. So the only way to get up and down the coast was by sea. And lo and behold, it wasn't a very wise move to hug the coast during the night because there was no navigation beacons. So they had a pretty hard time.
Do you have any other questions?
I was listening with a bit of horror about the asbestos. Presumably, asbestos was stripped out of vessels before the era of artificial reefs began.
That's right.
One hopes.
One
Yes.
hopes, yeah. I know they did that for the Brisbane and also the Brook. That was part of the environmental guidelines that you have to take into all the asbestos, all the heavy metals, all the oil. So yeah, they're taking care of it. It's pretty good. Yeah. In fact, you can't even dump the body at sea without getting pollution these days. So ashes are okay. If you decide to be buried at sea, you can get someone to do it, but you have to get permission from the government to do it. So keep that in mind.
Thanks very much. On that cheerful note, okay, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll agree this has been an absolutely wonderful presentation. I've learned a great deal that I had no idea of before, and it's wonderful to have the contributions also from the audience. Could we please show our appreciation together? We have a little item which we would like to give you in appreciation for your time and for giving us such a wonderful treat today. Thank you.
Yeah, just thanks again everybody for your attention, and it was nice to get the question at the end of it. We say that because otherwise it goes over time and we don't want that to happen. I know all the time's valuable. Thanks for your attention again, and thanks to the Historical Authority for inviting me to come along. Thank you.